Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a topic that I think is going to resonate with anyone who's ever tried to learn anything new. We're going to be tackling the science behind cramming versus spaced repetition.
And we've got a really fascinating mix of sources for this deep dive. We've got scientific articles, blog posts, even a transcript from a video I found where a med student is going all in on advocating for spaced repetition.
Oh, wow. A med student. They must have a lot riding on their ability to learn and remember information.
Right. I mean, it's make or break for them. So I think it's really telling that they're so passionate about spaced repetition.
I'm intrigued. So what's the mission for today? What are we hoping to uncover?
Well, I think we all want to know the truth about these two approaches. Does cramming actually work? Is spaced repetition all it's cracked up to be?
I'm with you. Let's cut through the noise and get to the evidence-based truth about how our brains learn best.
You know, what's really interesting is that this whole debate about cramming versus spaced repetition, it's not new. It actually goes back over a century to this pioneering psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus.
Hermann Ebbinghaus. Okay. Not familiar with him.
Yeah, he was doing groundbreaking research on memory back in the late 19th century. And get this, he mostly used himself as a test subject.
Wait, he used himself. Talk about dedication to science.
I know, right?
Yeah.
He was incredibly rigorous. And through all this self-experimentation, he ended up discovering what's now known as the forgetting curve.
The forgetting curve. Okay. I've heard of that, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details. Could you refresh my memory?
Of course. So the forgetting curve basically illustrates just how quickly we tend to forget newly learned information. You know, think about it. How many times have you struggled to remember something you just learned a couple of days ago? Like, it's just gone.
Oh, yeah, all the time. It's super frustrating.
Well, Ebbinghaus actually put a number to this phenomenon. He found that without any reinforcement, we can forget up to 90% of newly learned information within just 3 days.
90%. Wow, that's a pretty harsh reality check. Makes you wonder if all that effort is even worth it.
I know, it's kind of disheartening. But this is where this whole concept of cramming versus spaced repetition comes into play. These two strategies offer completely different approaches to tackling this forgetting curve problem.
Okay, so let's start with the one that I think a lot of us are probably most familiar with, and that's cramming. I mean, who hasn't pulled an all-nighter before a big test?
Oh yeah, we've all been there. Tons of coffee, highlighters everywhere, that feeling of desperation. And sometimes, honestly, it feels like it works, at least in the short term.
It does, right? You cram all night, you ace the test, and you think, hey, this cramming thing isn't so bad.
That's the trap. Because what cramming really does is it taps into your short-term memory and working memory. Those are like your brain's temporary storage spaces.
So you feel like you've got it all down because you can recall it right after cramming.
Exactly. But here's the problem. That information often hasn't been deeply encoded into your long-term memory, which is where it needs to be if you actually want to remember it later on.
So it's like writing something down on a sticky note and then expecting to find it months later. It's just not going to happen.
Perfect analogy. Cramming gives you those short-term gains, but it usually leads to long-term pains when you actually need that information down the line.
Ouch. That doesn't sound good.
It gets worse. Some studies actually suggest that all that cramming can actually have a negative impact on your working memory capacity over time. You know how you feel mentally drained after a long cram session?
Totally. Like my brain is fried.
That's your working memory being totally overloaded.
It's like trying to stuff an entire week's worth of groceries into a mini fridge. You might be able to squeeze it all in there, but it's not pretty, and some things are going to get crushed.
Haha, that's a great visual. And it really highlights the limitations of cramming. Now, on the flip side, you have spaced repetition, and this offers a much more strategic and brain-friendly way to learn.
Okay, so let's unpack spaced repetition. What exactly is it?
So instead of trying to cram everything into your brain all at once, spaced repetition is about revisiting information at increasing intervals. You space out your study sessions, and you actually allow some forgetting to happen between those reviews.
So it's almost like meeting up with a friend. The more time passes between visits, the more you have to catch up on. But each conversation deepens the connection.
I love that. That's a perfect way to put it, because each time you come back to the material, you're actually strengthening the neural pathways in your brain that are associated with that information. And by allowing some forgetting to happen, you're actually making your brain work harder to retrieve the information, which ends up solidifying the memory even more.
So like a workout for your brain.
Exactly. And just like with physical exercise, consistency is key. You can't expect to run a marathon after just one intense workout. With spaced repetition, it's all about regular, spaced-out practice that gradually strengthens those mental muscles.
So we're not fighting against our brain's natural forgetting mechanisms. We're actually working with them.
Exactly. And it turns out this approach is incredibly effective. There have been tons of studies showing the power of spaced repetition. For example, there was one study where students who used spaced repetition scored significantly higher on exams compared to those who crammed.
Even though they both spent the same total amount of time studying.
Exactly. And get this, the spaced repetition group, their scores were, on average, 50% higher.
Whoa, 50%. That's incredible.
It is. And it really shows that when you study can be just as important as how long you study. Spaced repetition is all about timing those review sessions to work with your brain's natural forgetting patterns.
I'm starting to rethink my whole approach to learning. I bet our listeners are too. This is all super fascinating, and I'm eager to dive into the practicalities of spaced repetition. How can we actually make this work in our lives? But I think this is a great place to pause for more about Part 1 of our deep dive into the science of spaced repetition. We'll be right back with Part 2 after a short break.
It really is like investing in your knowledge. You're making regular deposits and letting that knowledge compound over time.
I like that. But I have to admit, this whole idea of spaced repetition feels kind of counterintuitive at first. We're so used to thinking that we have to cram, 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 especially when we're under pressure. But what you're saying is that allowing ourselves to forget is actually a good thing.
Exactly. Forgetting is not the enemy. In fact, it's an opportunity. When you forget something and then you have to work to retrieve it, that effortful retrieval strengthens the memory. It's like a mental workout, building up your cognitive strength.
So you're saying it's good to struggle a bit when we're trying to remember something.
Absolutely. That struggle is a sign that your brain is working, that it's encoding that information more deeply. It's like forging a path through a dense forest. The more you travel that path, the clearer and easier it becomes.
Okay, that makes sense. So we know spaced repetition works, it's backed by science, but how do we actually put this into practice? It can feel kind of overwhelming to change our entire study routine.
I hear you. But the good news is you don't have to completely overhaul everything. You can start with small changes. One of the simplest ways to use spaced repetition is with flashcards.
Good old-fashioned flashcards.
Yeah.
So how do we make them work with spaced repetition?
Well, instead of just reviewing all your flashcards in one big session, divide them into smaller sets and review them at those increasing intervals we talked about. Review a set today, again tomorrow, then 3 days later, a week later, and so on.
So it's like building a personalized review schedule for each set of flashcards.
Precisely. And there are tons of tools that can help you with this. There's a whole world of spaced repetition software programs and apps that can automate that scheduling process.
Oh yeah, like Anki or Brainscape, I've heard of those.
Exactly. They use algorithms to track your progress and adjust those review intervals based on how well you're doing. They can be super helpful.
That sounds great. But what about people who prefer to keep things, analog? Can they still do spaced repetition without going digital?
Definitely. Even if you're not a tech person, you can still use spaced repetition. The key is to just be mindful of those increasing review intervals. You can make a simple spreadsheet or even just use a calendar to track when you should revisit each set of notes or flashcards.
So it's really about adapting the principle to fit your own learning style.
Exactly. Another tip is to break down large chunks of information into smaller pieces. That makes it a lot easier for your brain to process and remember things.
It's like tackling a huge project. You got to break it down into manageable tasks. Right?
Yeah, exactly. That way you prevent cognitive overload, which happens when you try to shove too much information into your brain at once.
Makes sense. So we've talked flashcard software, but are there any other, maybe more creative ways to work spaced repetition into our lives?
There's a technique called interleaving that works really well with spaced repetition.
Interleaving. Okay, I haven't heard of that.
It's basically mixing up different subjects or topics during your study sessions. So instead of spending 3 hours straight on biology, you might switch between biology, history, and maybe some language learning.
So you're constantly making your brain shift gears.
Yeah. It forces your brain to make connections between different concepts, and that can lead to deeper understanding and better memory.
And it probably helps to keep things from getting too boring, right?
Absolutely. Plus, there's evidence that interleaving actually makes the spacing effect even stronger.
Wow, it's like a learning super combo.
Right. And I think it's really important to address some of the misconceptions out there about cramming and spaced repetition.
Okay, let's bust some myths. What's one you hear a lot?
Well, one is that cramming is the way to go for multiple choice tests.
because you just need to recognize the right answer.
Yeah, but research actually shows that spaced repetition is better for pretty much all kinds of assessments, including essays and problem-solving tasks. It's about deep understanding, not just surface-level memorization.
So it's about truly mastering the material, not just regurgitating facts.
Exactly. Another myth is that spaced repetition is just too time-consuming, especially for people who are busy.
I can see why people would think that.
But the thing is, spaced repetition is actually really flexible. It's not about finding hours and hours to study. It's about using those little pockets of time you have throughout the day. Waiting for the bus, standing in line at the grocery store, even while you're brushing your teeth.
So you can turn those downtime moments into little learning opportunities.
Exactly. And with all the apps out there, it's easier than ever to do spaced repetition on the go. You can have your virtual flashcards with you all the time.
So spaced repetition really can fit into anyone's life, no matter how busy they are.
That's right. And it's not just for academic learning either. Spaced repetition can be used for pretty much anything you want to learn. Languages, music, new skills, even improving your memory in general.
So the principles we're talking about today, they can have a huge impact on so many areas of our lives.
Absolutely. And I think the key takeaway here is this. Spaced repetition is all about understanding how your brain learns and retains information best. And for most people, that means embracing the power of forgetting, spacing out your practice, and really engaging in that effortful retrieval process.
So counterintuitive as it may seem, forgetting is a key part of learning. And spaced repetition uses that natural process to help us learn more effectively and remember things for the long haul.
And one last thing I want to emphasize. Spaced repetition isn't some magic bullet. It does require effort and consistency. But the payoff is huge. It's about working with your brain, not against it.
It's about making a conscious choice to learn in a way that respects how our brains are wired. And I think that's a powerful message. It's about making a conscious choice to learn in a way that respects how our brains are wired. And I think that's a powerful message. But, we've talked about the benefits of spaced repetition, but I bet a lot of our listeners are wondering, okay, how do I actually make this work for me? How do I figure out those optimal review intervals?
That's a great question. And the truth is, there's no one-size-fits-all formula. It depends on a bunch of things, like how complex the material is, your prior knowledge, even your own personal learning style.
So it's not as simple as saying review everything every 3 days.
Nope. While there are some general guidelines you can find out there, the best way to figure it out is to just experiment and see what works best for you. Start with shorter intervals and then gradually increase them as you get more comfortable with the material.
So pay attention to how easily you're recalling things and adjust as needed.
Exactly. That's part of what makes spaced repetition so cool. It's personalized. It adapts to you. And remember those apps we talked about? They can actually be super helpful for figuring out those optimal intervals for you.
Oh, that's a relief. They take out some of the guesswork.
Right. So it's less intimidating to get started.
Now, another thing I hear a lot is that spaced repetition is only good for memorizing facts, like vocabulary words or dates, but that it doesn't really work for more complex or conceptual stuff. What do you think about that?
That's a myth I'm happy to bust. While spaced repetition is definitely awesome for memorizing facts, it can do so much more than that. It can be used to learn really complex concepts, problem-solving strategies, even creative skills.
Wow, so it's really about any kind of information or skill you want to master.
Exactly. It's all about strengthening those connections in your brain, no matter what you're trying to learn.
It's like building those mental muscles, making them stronger and more adaptable.
That's a great way to put it. So whether you're trying to wrap your head around quantum physics, become a master chef, or learn a new language, spaced repetition can help you get there.
This has been a really insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground, busted some myths, and I think given our listeners a really solid understanding of how powerful spaced repetition can be. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. What's the one key takeaway you hope they'll remember from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember this. Learning is a journey. It's not a destination. And spaced repetition is like a fantastic map and compass for that journey. It's not about cramming information. It's about building a deep and lasting understanding of the world around us.
Beautifully said. And to add to that, I'd say don't be afraid to experiment. Play around with different techniques, different tools. Find what clicks for you. Be consistent and embrace that forgetting is actually a key part of the learning process.
Yes. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the science of spaced repetition. We hope this conversation has sparked some new ideas and inspired you to experiment with this incredible learning tool.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you all.
And remember, keep those brains engaged, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next episode of The Deep Dive.